Welcome to Forever and Always Sweet Stories, where love gets messy, hearts get tangled, and somehow it all still ends in a swoon-worthy happily ever after. If you're into slow burns, heartfelt drama, and just enough charm to make you grin mid-laundry, you're exactly where you should be. New stories drop every week, so hit that subscribe button. Your future self will thank you. The Duke's Winter Bride. Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Snow. Northumberland, England, December 1813. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, blanketing the narrow lanes of Larkspur Hollow in white. The village, tucked between forest and moor, lay still under a sky of pewter clouds. Chimneys smoked lazily. Doors remained shut against the biting wind. But Eleanor Grayson was already awake. She tied her wool cloak tightly around her, the wind tugging at its hem like impatient fingers. Her boots crunched along the snow-covered path leading into the woods behind the cottage she shared with her ailing father. A trip to gather kindling, a small task, a necessary one. Life for the poor had no regard for weather. Eleanor had grown up at Larkspur Hollow, the ivy-strangled cottage at the edge of the wood, where her father had served as the village notary for over 2 decades. It had never been a prosperous life, but it was a respectable one, ruled by decency, ink-stained hours, and the rustle of legal documents stacked neatly in the study. Her mother, long gone, had left her books and music, and the kind of quiet poise that marked a gentlewoman, even without a dowry. Now, with her father in fading health, and the winter tightening its grip, Eleanor lived by thrift and instinct, determined to make do with what little she had left. She carried a basket over one arm, the other wrapped tightly around herself. Her breath rose in clouds. The woods here were familiar, skeletal trees forming a cathedral of frost and quiet. That was when she saw him. A dark shape, motionless, at the base of a birch tree. Eleanor froze. Her first thought was, a body. Her second, a man. But was he still alive? She hesitated only a heartbeat before rushing forward, skirts catching on brambles. Snow had gathered over his shoulders and back like a shroud. He was slumped, head against the trunk, eyes closed. Dark curls, nearly black, framed a pale, sharply angled face. She dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the cold seeping into her skirts. "Sir," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. No response. He was breathing, shallowly. His lips were blue. One gloved hand clutched at his side. There was blood, dried and dark against his shirt. His greatcoat was heavy and finely made, though torn. Not a common man. Panic flared in her chest. Should she run for help? There was no doctor in the village, and the vicar was away in Durham. No one else would come willingly. Gossip would spread like wildfire if she brought an unknown man into her home. And yet, she could not leave him. "God help me," she muttered, dropping her basket. She removed her scarf and wrapped it around his neck, then took his arm and pulled. He was heavy, far too heavy for her slight frame, but she was determined. It took nearly 20 minutes. She dragged him across the snowy path, breath coming in sharp bursts, pausing every few feet. By the time they reached the back door of the cottage, Eleanor was trembling with exhaustion, soaked through with melting snow. Her hands were raw and red. Inside, the warmth of the fire hit her like a wave. She laid the stranger down on the narrow pallet beside the hearth. Her father slept soundly in the next room, dulled by laudanum. The cottage smelled of old herbs, pine, and the faint scent of lavender soap. She stoked the fire higher, unfastened the man's coat with trembling fingers, and eased off his boots. His shirt was torn at the side, bloodied. The wound looked like it had been made by a blade, not clean, but jagged, as if he'd fallen. With practiced hands, Eleanor cleaned the cut using hot water and salve. She whispered reassurances, though he was unconscious. She was no stranger to tending wounds. Her mother had long kept a stillroom and possessed a thorough knowledge of household medicine, a necessity in any well-run home. Eleanor had learned by her side how to brew teas, soothe aching heads, and bind sprains with a sure hand. Care was not a gift, but a duty, one she never questioned. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and studied him. His features were noble. High cheekbones, a strong nose, the kind of mouth that rarely smiled but might once. He looked aristocratic, even in unconsciousness. But what was a gentleman, clearly a wealthy one, doing in the woods alone, injured, without escort or horse? And what would she do when he awoke? She sat in the rocker by the fire, arms folded tightly across her chest. She should be frightened, but she wasn't, only curious. As the snow thickened outside, Eleanor kept watch through the long, silent night. He woke at dawn. A gasp tore from his throat as he bolted upright. The movement sent pain crashing through him. Eleanor was already by his side, pushing him gently down. "Easy," she said. "You're hurt." He blinked, dazed, his eyes, icy blue, fixed on her face. Where am I?" he rasped. "In my cottage," she said simply. "I found you in the woods." He stared at the ceiling. The firelight danced across the rafters. Then he looked back at her, gaze narrowed. "I don't know who I am." A silence fell. Eleanor's heart stopped. "You don't remember?" she asked quietly. He shook his head, slowly. "Nothing. I remember falling, snow, pain, and a sound. Bells, maybe." Eleanor sat back, stunned. She had suspected this was no ordinary accident, but for him to have no memory at all. "Well," she said softly, recovering. "Until you do, I suppose I'll call you. Mr. Winter." One corner of his mouth twitched. Charming. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Winter," she said. "I gathered that," he replied. He winced, and she offered him a cup of water. He took it, his hands shaking slightly. She saw how he studied her, curious, cautious, trying to make sense of her presence. But he did not look away quickly. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked. "I probably should be," she said, "but you don't look particularly threatening in your current state." He smiled faintly. "That's fair." For the first time, she noticed the shape of a ring mark on his left hand. The skin was slightly paler there. He'd worn it often. A signet ring, perhaps. Nobility. He was no simple traveller. But she said nothing. Instead, she took the cloth from the basin and gently dabbed his forehead. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Who you are, how you got here." He looked at her, eyes full of questions he couldn't yet form. And for a moment, in the hush of that early morning light, with snow falling quietly outside and the fire crackling low, Eleanor felt something unspoken pass between them. A thread, delicate and new. She had no idea who he was, or what storm he would bring into her world. But fate, it seemed, had already taken her hand. Chapter 2. The Man Without a Name. Larkspur Hollow, December 1813. For days the snow continued to fall, soft as ash from heaven, sealing the village of Larkspur Hollow in a cocoon of white silence. The roads vanished beneath drifts. Frost painted the window panes in delicate lace. And within the modest Grayson cottage, time seemed to pause. The stranger, Julian, as he would come to be known, lay beside the hearth, slowly reclaiming the colour in his cheeks, while Eleanor moved about the cottage like a quiet warden of warmth and care. She was not a ghost, though she often moved like one, light on her feet, with the grace of someone taught to be unseen. Her beauty was not the gaudy sort prized in London drawing rooms, but rather the kind men remembered years later without knowing why. Soft chestnut hair that caught fire in the lamplight, eyes like moss under sunlight, green-flecked hazel, ever watchful. Her mouth, full and unpainted, carried more truth in a quiet line than most women gave in a sonnet. That morning, she wore a wool dress the colour of old rose, the sleeves slightly too short after years of careful patching. A cream fichu was tucked modestly into the bodice, and a grey knit shawl clung to her shoulders. Her boots, worn but polished, clicked softly across the floorboards. She knelt beside the hearth, her fingers pink from the cold as she turned a thick iron pot suspended over the flames. The scent of root vegetables, rosemary and wild garlic drifted through the room. Julian stirred on the cot, blinking toward the firelight. "You're awake," she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Good timing." He made a sound between a groan and a sigh. "Do I smell food?" "You do." She smiled. "Parsnip and barley soup with smoked ham," she said, rising to ladle it into a thick earthenware bowl. "And oatcakes, my mother's recipe. She grew up near the border, thought everything tasted better with oats and salt." He let his head fall back against the pillow. "I've died and gone to heaven." She chuckled, rising to ladle the soup into a thick earthenware bowl. The oatcakes, crisply browned and still warm from the griddle, were wrapped in a cloth to keep them soft. She set the tray beside him and adjusted the pillow behind his back with surprising gentleness. Julian studied her. "You stitched me up," he said suddenly, voice low. "Didn't you?" She looked down at the pot. "I helped." "But not alone?" "No," she said. "Mrs. Albridge came, the vicar's wife. She's no stranger to cuts and stubborn boys. I told her you were no threat." He blinked slowly, taking that in. "You're very kind," he murmured. Eleanor gave him a look. "I expect flattery in return for soup." He smiled, but it faded quickly. "What if I don't like who I was?" She paused. "Then you have a chance to be someone better." He looked down into the bowl, watching the steam rise in soft spirals. She watched him for a moment before retreating to her chair by the fire, picking up her mending again. As the wind howled against the eaves, the small room seemed an island of warmth in a cold world. He ate slowly, with the care of someone unused to needing help. His long fingers trembled slightly as he broke the oatcake and dipped it into the thick, savoury broth. She noticed, but said nothing. Later, when he was settled, he gestured to the book on the table. "What were you reading yesterday?" Eleanor picked it up. "The Mysteries of Udolpho. Have you heard of it?" He tilted his head. "It sounds familiar. Is it terribly Gothic?" "Unashamedly," she smiled. "There are brooding castles and secret staircases and weeping heroines with shining eyes." He looked at her steadily. "Do you enjoy weeping heroines?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I prefer ones who burn the castle down." Julian laughed, though it ended in a grimace of pain. "Careful," she said, setting the book aside. "You're not healed enough to laugh yet." He leaned his head back, eyes closed. "Perhaps you'll read it to me later." "Perhaps," she replied, though she already knew she would. That evening, as twilight bled into deep winter blue, she lit a beeswax candle and moved through the cottage preparing tea. Her hands worked swiftly and surely, slicing a bit of sugared ginger, setting out a small wedge of cheese and the last of the bread, now toasted and rubbed with garlic. He watched her the entire time. "Most would be wary," he said. "You aren't." She stirred the broth again, unhurried. "You don't feel like a threat." "You should be more careful," he said. "You don't know me." No, she agreed. But I know what you've shown me. Politeness and patience, whatever else you were. I don't believe you were cruel. He said nothing. She finally looked at him then, candlelight dancing in her eyes. Do you think you were? He blinked. I don't know, but I hope not. Eleanor set the tea down beside him. The scent of it, black leaf with cloves and orange rind, drifted between them like a memory not yet spoken. From the pocket of her apron, she drew a small silver object. I found this in your coat. He took it, turning it over in his hands. It was a fob watch. Damaged, its glass cracked, but still beautiful, engraved with fine detail and the initials J.B. A faint line of white marked his ring finger. Julian's brow furrowed. J.B. Julian, perhaps. Yes, that feels right. Then Julian you are, until told otherwise. He exhaled slowly and leaned back, cradling the watch to his chest like a compass he didn't yet know how to use. Later, as the fire burned low and the windows blurred with snow, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair, her father snoring softly in the next room. Julian was asleep now, brow relaxed, lips slightly parted. In sleep, he looked younger, gentler, more lost. She watched him, a book in her lap, though her eyes did not move across the page. Somewhere, a candle flickered low. Outside, the snow fell in hushed silence. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the book's spine. She did not know who this man was, nor what his return to memory might cost her. But she already feared the loss of what they had now. Chapter 3. Secrets by Candlelight. Larkspur Hollow, December 1813. The wind had stopped by morning, but the hush it left behind was not peaceful. It was watchful, the kind of stillness that made even the fire crackle softly, as if afraid to speak too loudly. The snow outside had grown deeper, draping the cottage in a white silence that felt almost sacred. Julian sat propped up against the far wall, tucked beneath a thick quilt, his lean yet powerful frame still weakened from injury. His linen shirt, borrowed from Eleanor's father, was slightly too small, the collar open at the throat, sleeves rolled back to reveal his forearms. The firelight gilded the planes of his face, catching on his strong jaw and the unruly black hair curling damply at his temples. Across the room, Eleanor moved with quiet confidence. Her gown today was moss-green wool, worn but well kept, the high waist tied with a faded ribbon that drew gently around the curve of her back. A white fichu softened the neckline, and a shawl, woven with plum and pine-coloured threads, was draped over her shoulders. As she passed the hearth, the faint scent of lavender and winter air brushed over him, familiar and strangely comforting. She was tending to supper, humming under her breath. He couldn't quite make out the tune. Something gentle and old. The cottage was warm, though small. A low ceiling of smoke-darkened beams, shelves lined with crockery and dried herbs, a single, well-worn armchair, and the narrow cot on which Julian now lay. It was no grand estate, but it had heart. And that heart, he was beginning to realise, was her. "Smells like heaven," he said, his voice rough from sleep. Eleanor smiled over her shoulder. "It's only roasted chestnuts with butter and thyme, and bread. And we've some cheese left, barely, and pickled carrots. Nothing very fine." He watched her ladle the food onto two mismatched plates, her slender wrists moving with elegant precision. "It's finer than anything I can remember," he said. She returned to his bedside and handed him a tray, careful not to let her fingers brush his. He noticed. Steam curled from the plate, rich and earthy. The roasted chestnuts had gone soft in the butter, melting on the tongue. The bread was dark rye, thick-crusted, still warm from the hearth. "You truly could be a cook at any London inn," he said after the first bite. Eleanor laughed softly. I think they'd take issue with my lack of a cook's figure. His gaze flicked to her then, sharp and sudden. I wouldn't change a thing about your figure, he said, before he could stop himself. Her eyes lifted to meet his, something warm, startled, and quiet in her expression. But she didn't answer. He cursed himself inwardly and turned back to the bowl. They ate in near silence after that, the only sounds the wind brushing against the shutters and the crackle of firewood. The cottage felt sealed off from the rest of the world, a snow globe suspended in time. After the meal, Eleanor cleared their bowls and returned with tea, strong black leaf steeped with cloves and a hint of orange peel. She poured it into earthenware cups, her hands steady even as her heart was not. Julian sipped slowly, letting the spiced heat warm his throat. I had another dream. She glanced at him, one brow lifting slightly. I was standing in a ballroom, enormous, gilded walls, candlelight like stars. Music was playing, strings, waltz, something elegant, and there was a woman. She wore crimson. Her face I couldn't see. But I remember her perfume. Something sharp, like jasmine and smoke. Eleanor's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. Do you think she was someone you loved? I don't know. She felt distant, beautiful, but cold, like a painting you admire but don't want to touch. A pause, then carefully. Not like you. The fire shifted. Eleanor's breath caught. Julian, she began, but he held up a hand. I know nothing of who I was. But I know what feels real. And this warmth, this place, you feel more real to me than all the gold and lace in that dream. Her throat went dry. She stood and walked to the hearth, feigning the need to stoke the fire. Her cheeks were flushed, but not from heat. Why are you helping me? He asked, not for the first time. She stared into the flames. Because you arrived in a world where I thought nothing new could happen. I had made peace with quiet mornings and long silences. I'd learned to fold my heart in on itself and not expect more than what I had. And then I found you, and you looked at me like I was not just a girl with patched hems and a name no one remembered. She turned. Her eyes were bright, unshed tears glittering like frost. You looked at me like I mattered. Julian rose, slowly. He still leaned heavily on the wall, but he crossed the few feet to her side with purpose. The shawl slipped slightly from her shoulder. He reached out and touched her hand, gently, reverently, before lifting it to his lips. He didn't kiss it, just held it there, his breath warming her skin. I remember nothing. But if I am a man worth anything, I will not forget this. You. This moment. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest, too loud, too vulnerable. Don't make promises you can't keep, she whispered. His eyes searched hers. This one I can. She couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake beneath her patched quilt, watching the shadows on the ceiling shift as the candle guttered out beside her bed. From the other room came the faint, steady rhythm of his breathing. Not loud, but present. Julian's presence lingered like the echo of touch. Warm, disquieting, impossible to forget. It clung to her skin, even through silence and walls. In the dark hours before dawn, she slipped quietly from bed and padded barefoot down the ladder into the hearthroom. The fire had burned low, but still glowed in the ashes. Julian slept on the cot, brows drawn slightly, his fingers curled into the blanket. Beside him, his coat lay across the chair. She reached for it, intending to fold it. And something caught the light. A ring. Small, heavy, and gold. It had slid into the lining of his coat, nearly hidden. She drew it out with trembling fingers. A signet. A falcon in flight, perched above the crowned A of a noble house. The blood drained from her face. She knew that crest. She had seen it once in a book at the vicar's library, The Dukes of Ashbourne. Julian Blackwell. He wasn't just a gentleman. He was a duke. She stood in the middle of the room, the fire flickering softly behind her, the ring trembling in her hand. And for the first time since she'd found him in the snow, Eleanor Grayson felt truly, utterly afraid. Because men like Julian belonged to carriages and coronets, to marble halls and drawing rooms filled with titled smiles. And she was a girl with calloused hands, a threadbare gown, and a heart already too full of him. Chapter 4. A Heart Uncovered. Larkspur Hollow, December 1813. The snow returned the next morning, falling in fat, soft flakes that blanketed the hills and hedgerows in a hush that felt like waiting. Eleanor stood at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the white world deepen. Her breath misted the glass. Somewhere in the trees, a blackbird sang low and slow, as if uncertain whether winter had truly settled. Behind her, the fire crackled lazily. Julian stirred on the cot, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He had recovered enough to sit unaided now, and sometimes walked short laps around the room with a grim sort of determination. The wound at his side was healing, but something deeper, more shadowed, lingered behind his gaze. Eleanor turned as he rose to his feet, one hand pressed to the wooden beam for balance. "Don't push too far," she said, already moving to help him. "I'm tired of sitting," he muttered. "I need air. Light. Something other than these four walls." She bit her lip. "It's snowing heavily." "I don't care." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but only to the ridge and back." She helped him dress, her fingers working at the buttons of the borrowed coat he wore. It was too short in the arms, the collar fraying, but her hands were steady despite the tremor in her chest. She could feel the warmth of his body through the cloth. Smell the subtle masculine scent that clung to him now. Pine, smoke, and something she didn't recognize but craved. He watched her face the entire time. When they stepped outside, the wind was biting, but the snow was soft underfoot, muffling their steps. Eleanor wore her heaviest cloak, a deep blue lined with quilted flannel, and a fur-trimmed bonnet pulled snug around her braid. Her cheeks flushed pink against the cold. Julian leaned on her more than he liked, but he said nothing. They walked slowly, following the narrow trail that wound behind the cottage, and climbed to a low rise overlooking the valley. The world was white in every direction. Smoke curled from the village chimneys in the distance. The trees stood heavy with frost, their limbs bent like old women in prayer. Eleanor paused at the top of the ridge, her breath steaming. Julian stood beside her, chest rising and falling harder than usual. He turned his face into the wind, closed his eyes. "This place," he murmured, "feels more like home than anywhere I've ever known." Her eyes turned to him sharply. "But you don't remember anywhere else," she said softly. He opened his eyes, looked at her. "No," he said. "But I remember how loneliness feels, and I haven't felt it since I opened my eyes in your cottage." Eleanor couldn't look at him. Her throat closed. The snow fell between them, gently, like a veil. Back inside, she poured hot water into the teapot and stirred in dried mint and apple peel. The scent rose quickly, filling the cottage with warmth and memory. She set out 2 slices of spiced gingerbread, slightly crisp from the hearth, and thin curls of pear that had been dried months ago when the world was still green. Her hands shook slightly as she set the tray down. Julian was watching her again, always watching. "You're quiet," he said. She poured the tea. Should I be otherwise? I thought perhaps you were angry with me. She blinked at that. Whatever for? For being who I am. Or was. You found the ring. Eleanor froze. She looked up slowly. His eyes were fixed on her. You saw me with it? She asked. I was half asleep. But yes. There was a long silence between them. The fire popped once, startling her. You're Julian Blackwell, she said finally. Duke of Ashbourne. He nodded, slowly. Apparently so. And what happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know, he said. But I know I don't want to leave. Eleanor rose and turned away, her fingers tightening on the edge of the chair. She walked to the window again, though the glass had already fogged. You will, though, she said. You'll remember more. The name, the duty, the inheritance. You'll be expected to go back, marry some heiress, host balls, attend Parliament. Julian stood, slowly, painfully. He crossed the room to her and stood behind her, not touching, but close. His breath stirred the curls at her temple. And what if I don't want that? She turned then, suddenly, eyes bright with unshed tears. You have to want that. It's your life. I'm just... She broke off, voice trembling. I'm just a village girl, she said, softer now, with calloused hands and an old dress and no dowry to speak of. You can't stay here, Julian, not forever. He reached for her hand. You're not just anything, he said fiercely. Eleanor. She stepped back, pulling her hand away. Her heart was breaking even as she hardened her voice. Don't make promises you can't keep. Not to me. The air between them went still, hot and cold, charged and aching. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment it was clear. He wanted to kiss her. The realization flared like fire between them. She felt it, knew it. Her breath hitched, but he didn't. He stepped back. Then I won't make promises, he said. I'll prove them. That night, Eleanor sat awake long after the fire had burned to embers, her hands wrapped around her teacup, untouched. The cottage felt too small. Her skin felt too tight. She couldn't banish the way he'd looked at her, like he saw her. Not the poor girl, not even the rescuer. But her. The woman beneath the careful strength. The soul she'd hidden so well. She pressed her palm to her lips, as if to quiet the ache rising there. And outside, the snow fell in silence, bearing witness to all the words neither of them had yet spoken. Chapter 5. Truth in the Firelight. Larkspur Hollow, December 1813. The thaw began with a whisper, a drip from the eaves, a gentle groan as the snow loosened its hold on the cottage roof. The world had begun to stir again, as if it had only paused for breath. Eleanor stood at the window, watching rivulets slide down the glass like tears. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fire still burned strong behind her. The morning had passed in silence. Julian hadn't spoken much since yesterday, since the almost kiss, since the words that had struck too close to her fragile heart. Now he sat in her father's chair, legs stretched before the fire, his fingers resting in his lap. The flames threw warm light across the angles of his face. Serious, too serious for a man who had once teased her over oatcakes. He hadn't slept well. She'd heard him in the night, pacing, murmuring in his sleep. A name, she thought. A place. But when she asked, he shook his head. Eleanor turned from the window. Would you like more tea? No, thank you, he said, voice quieter than usual. She poured herself a cup anyway. The cottage smelled of thyme, wool, and the last of the wood smoke from yesterday's bread baking. A comfort. Or it had been. I should go to the village today, she said, mostly to herself. We're very low on tea and we're out of soap. Julian looked up. I'll come. She blinked. You're not well enough. I need to stretch my legs. But Julian... He stood, slowly, carefully. I'll be careful. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. She didn't want to admit the real reason she didn't want him to come. She was afraid someone might recognize him. The village square was half melted and mucky. The snow churned beneath the wheels of passing carts. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the baker's boy ran past with a bag of flour slung over his shoulder. Larkspur Hollow was stirring again, blinking into the cold light of late December. Julian walked at her side, gloved hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He'd tied a scarf around his throat, pulled his cap low, and let his head remain slightly bowed. Not from shame, but from the fatigue that still clung to him. Still, people stared. Eleanor saw it in the way Mrs. Digby paused on her porch steps, in how the blacksmith's daughter dropped her pail. Not fear, curiosity. Who's the stranger? She heard someone whisper. Tall one he is. Come, Eleanor murmured, quickening her step. We'll stop at Mrs. Pritchard's first. But halfway across the green, a voice called out, Julian! She froze. A man was approaching from the edge of the square, dismounting a dark bay horse. His coat was thick and tailored, his boots gleaming with polish. He removed his riding gloves as he walked, revealing a flash of a signet ring. Eleanor didn't know him. Julian, however, went utterly still. The colour drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The man reached them. He was in his early 30s, fair-haired, clean-shaven, with the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. My God, he said softly, eyes locked on Julian. Ashbourne, it's really you. Julian's hands tightened into fists. The man laughed, part disbelief, part relief. We've searched half of England. I rode up from Yorkshire last week. No one expected to find you in a village this size. Julian swallowed. Do I know you? The man's smile faded. Julian, it's me, Marcus Thorne, your cousin. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Cousin, confirmed, Duke, real. Thorne, Julian repeated, like a man turning over an old coin, half forgotten. You've been missing nearly 3 weeks, Marcus said, lowering his voice. There was an attack near the border. Highwaymen. Your coach was overturned. The driver's body was found 2 days later. They assumed you'd been taken or killed. I was found in the snow, Julian said softly. By her. He looked at Eleanor. Marcus glanced at her then. He took her in with a single sweep. Her simple gown, her chapped hands, the faint curl of hair escaping her bonnet. The warmth left his eyes. Well, he said stiffly, you've done my cousin a great kindness, miss. Grayson, she replied, her voice low. Eleanor Grayson. Julian moved closer to her. Not much, but enough to make it clear where his allegiance lay. Marcus's jaw twitched. The Duchess will be beside herself when she hears you're alive. Eleanor blinked. The Duchess? His mother, Marcus clarified. She's been near mad with worry, and the estate, well, everything's been held in trust while the matter of his survival remained uncertain. Now, at least, there'll be no scandal. Eleanor flinched at the word. Scandal. As if she were one. Julian turned to Marcus. I need more time. There's a carriage waiting in York. You should come. Regain your memory. Return to your life. Julian's gaze lingered on Eleanor. Her eyes were downcast. I'll come, he said slowly. But not today. Marcus looked displeased, but nodded. Very well. I'll return in 2 days. Be ready." He turned and strode back toward his horse without another word. That night, the fire snapped and hissed, but Eleanor felt cold. Julian sat across from her, his face lit only by the firelight. He looked older somehow, distant. He said, "The Duchess," she said softly. "My mother," he replied. "I remember her now, bits and pieces." She nodded. "And Marcus?" "Seems he's my cousin." "So, you'll go?" Julian looked at her sadly. "I don't want to," he said, "but I must." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "You have a life, a title, a name. You belong to a world I don't even visit in dreams." He stood and crossed the room, knelt beside her. "You've been my only world," he said. "For weeks, you've been my breath and warmth and heartbeat. I don't know what's waiting for me in Ashbourne. But I know what's here." Her eyes brimmed. "And when you remember everything, when your life calls you back." His hand rose to her cheek. "Then I'll come back." She closed her eyes, breathing through the ache. "Promise me nothing," she whispered. "Not unless you mean to break me." He said nothing, only kissed her forehead, and walked back to his cot. The fire burned low. Outside, the frost returned. And inside, Eleanor sat very still, hands in her lap, feeling the quiet crumble of a dream slipping through her fingers. Chapter 6. Return to Society. Ashbourne House, January 1814. The iron gates of Ashbourne House swung open with a slow, creaking grace that matched the rhythm of Julian Blackwell's thoughts. As the carriage rolled up the long drive lined with winter-stripped oaks, he watched the great manor rise into view, all gleaming windows and white stone facades, flanked by symmetrical gardens buried in snow. He should have felt a sense of homecoming. He felt nothing. No, he felt too much, and none of it comfort. The house was vast, the entrance hall echoing with the clicks of boot heels and the murmurs of servants. Marble floors stretched out beneath stained glass and towering portraits of stern Blackwells long dead. A fire roared in the hearth like a lion in a cage. A butler bowed low. "Your Grace." The words rang in his ears. Your Grace. A title. A weight. A crown of iron. He murmured a polite thank you, though his voice felt foreign in his throat. His mother appeared at the top of the marble staircase, flanked by 2 footmen and clad in dark plum silk and jet beads. Her presence halted the room. She descended like a monarch, not a mother, her expression carved from porcelain and pride. Her silver-streaked hair was swept into an intricate coil, not a strand out of place. "Julian." Her voice was cool, controlled. "So, it's true." He bowed, unsure why he felt like a schoolboy again. The Duchess paused a pace away, her gloved hands folded at her waist. "You vanish for nearly a month. Your carriage is found overturned. Blood on the road. Not a word. Not a note. Do you realize the scandal you've caused?" "I had no memory," he said, voice tight. "I barely knew my own name." "So I've been told," she replied, voice clipped. "You were found in a hovel, I hear, a village girl's cottage." He tensed. "Her name is Eleanor Grayson." The Duchess sniffed. "A gentlewoman, technically. Though I must say, the line between respectability and ruin is thinner than ever these days." He said nothing. She studied him for a moment, then turned away. "You'll have to recover quickly. There is a great deal to undo." That evening, he sat in the Ashbourne Library, once his sanctuary, and stared into the fire. The room had not changed. Tall mahogany shelves, oil portraits, the scent of ink and tobacco and leather. Familiar. But it felt like wearing a coat that no longer fit. Marcus entered with 2 glasses of brandy. "You remember much?" "Enough," Julian murmured. He remembered tutors and titles, fencing lessons, tedious family dinners, and glittering seasons in London. He remembered glittering parties and echoing laughter, smiles that faded the moment backs were turned. He did not remember joy, except for one flicker, the scent of lavender and wood smoke, and the quiet sound of her voice reading aloud, steady as snowfall. "Eleanor." "You've a ball to attend," Marcus said, sipping. The Duchess insisted. "Of course she did," Julian said flatly. "There's talk of Lady Cassandra Ashworth," Marcus added. Julian didn't reply, but his stomach curled. Cassandra. He could remember her now. Golden curls, lips like lacquered fruit, perfume like crushed violets, beautiful, proper, cold as the marble beneath her slippers, and not Eleanor. In the weeks that followed. At the Ashworth Ball, London. The ballroom glittered like a dream spun from ice and gold. Candlelight shimmered from crystal chandeliers, gilding the ladies in their silks and satins. A string quartet played something elegant and restrained, and the air smelled of beeswax, perfume, and champagne. Julian stood near a column, dressed in black tailcoat and ivory cravat, a sapphire pin at his throat. Every eye in the room seemed to follow him. The Duke returned, the air restored, the talk of the season. He barely heard them. He danced with those to whom he was introduced, bowed where required, and smiled through conversations he scarcely heard. But his eyes kept straying, to the window, to the gardens beyond, to the memory of Eleanor's hands kneading dough beside the fire, her voice soft in the hush of snowfall. Cassandra approached near midnight, wrapped in red silk that gleamed like blood in the candlelight. "My Lord Duke," she purred, "you vanish and return a mystery." "Lady Cassandra," he inclined his head, "you haven't changed." "I try not to," she said with a dazzling smile. "It's so tiresome chasing reinvention." He offered her a dance. It was expected. Her hand was smooth, gloved, delicate. It felt wrong. Halfway through the waltz, he heard a few bars of the string quartet's melody, and froze. A lullaby. Played too grandly, too fast, but still. The lullaby Eleanor had hummed as she brewed tea on cold mornings. The music wrapped around him like mist. He stopped mid-turn. "Julian?" Cassandra blinked. "Are you unwell?" "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Forgive me. The room is close." He bowed, just enough to satisfy propriety, and slipped out into the garden. The night air was sharp, the cold biting, but he welcomed it. He walked past statues and hedges, ignoring the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. Not in this world of polish and politeness, of chandeliers and shadowed glances. He belonged in a cottage filled with books and herbs and firelight. He belonged where he'd been seen, not admired, where he'd been known. Julian stopped beneath a bare winter tree and looked up at the sky. Stars blinked faintly through the London haze. "I'll come back," he had promised her. He hadn't, but he would. Tomorrow, before he lost his nerve. He would go to Larkspur Hollow. He would tell her everything, that he remembered, that he still woke with her name on his lips, that the title meant nothing if she wasn't beside him. He turned and walked toward the house, determination rising like a storm in his chest. And behind him the music played on, cold and lovely, and utterly wrong. Chapter 7. What She Left Behind. Larkspur Hollow and Bath, late January 1814. The road to Larkspur Hollow was half buried in snow, the sky a low pewter dome pressing down on the countryside. Julian rode alone, gloved hands tight on the reins, heart thudding with something too jagged to be hope. It had been nearly 3 weeks since he left this place. 3 weeks of 2 formal dinners, carefully managed appearances, and laughter that never touched his bones. Each day at Ashbourne had felt more like a performance, and less like a life. But this could still be real. The cottage came into view, tucked against the woods like a memory. The snow was freshly drifted. No smoke curled from the chimney. No glow lit the windows. Still, he dismounted, walked up the path, boots crunching through the frost. He knocked, once, twice. "Miss Grayson?" his voice caught. "Eleanor?" No answer. The door across the lane opened instead. Mrs. Pritchard stood there, apron dusted with flour, eyes soft with something too knowing. "Your Grace," she said gently. "You've come too late." His heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "She's gone," the old woman said. "Left just before the thaw." Julian stared at her. "Gone where?" "Bath." He blinked. "Why?" Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'd best come in." Inside, her fire was low but warm. She poured tea into 2 chipped cups and sat with a sigh. Julian remained standing. She took a position with a lady there, a noble widow, Lady Dunthorpe, well regarded, so I hear. He could barely speak. "But when?" "3 days ago, after her father's funeral." The world tilted. "He died," Julian said, stunned. Mrs. Pritchard nodded slowly. "Not long after you left. He'd been fading for some time, though he did his best to hide it. I think he held on as long as he could for her." Julian ran a hand through his hair, the gesture sharp with guilt. "Why didn't she write? I would have come back." Mrs. Pritchard's expression softened, but her voice held steady. "She could have written. But pride's a hard thing to swallow, especially when your heart's already aching." He looked down, jaw tight. "She waited, if it matters," she added gently. "Longer than she should have, if you ask me. But after her father passed, she needed to move forward, on her own terms." He swallowed. "She knew where I was. Ashbourne is no secret." "Aye, but she didn't know if she still had a place in your life." A pause. And she wasn't about to go asking for one. Julian stared down at the floor. "She really left," he said quietly, without a word. Mrs. Pritchard looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose, opened a drawer, and handed him a small wrapped bundle. "She left this. Said if you ever returned, I was to give it to you." Julian sat then, suddenly boneless. He unwrapped the bundle with numb fingers. Inside was a worn book, a copy of The Tempest, its pages softened from use. His breath caught. On the inside cover, written in a careful hand, was one simple line. "You once asked what I saw in you. I wish you'd stayed long enough to see it too." Julian pressed the book closed, eyes stinging. "I don't know where she's staying," Mrs. Pritchard said, voice quiet now. "But I reckon a man like you has ways of finding things out." He nodded, standing slowly. "She's strong," the old woman added. "But that doesn't mean she wasn't hurt." "I know." He bowed, deeply, gratefully, and left without finishing his tea. Snowflakes had begun to fall again as he mounted his horse. This time, he wouldn't leave her behind. Bath, a week later. The city was warmer than Larkspur Hollow, misted with rain instead of snow. Bath's golden terraces curved through the hills like an elegant script, and its streets were lively with carriages, parasols, and well-dressed walkers with gossip curling behind them like perfume. and they were gossiping about him. Julian had only been in the city a day, but word spread fast. The Duke of Ashbourne, alive, lost in a snowstorm, nursed by a village girl, reappeared weeks later, unannounced, and very much changed. Every drawing room was alight with theories. Every hostess scrambled to secure his attendance. By the time he expressed the slightest interest in appearing at a musicale, invitations arrived by the dozen. But Julian only wanted to see one person. Lady Canfield's musicale was a respectable affair. Lace-draped candles, low harp music, and tightly corseted chaperones guarding marriageable daughters like hunting dogs at heel. Julian endured 3 rounds of polite interrogation before escaping toward the edge of the room, his attention scanning the crowd. He did not know what he would say to her, only that he had to say something, anything, before she slipped from his life for good. Then he heard it. Her laugh. Soft, slightly uncertain, but unmistakably hers. He turned toward the sound, and there she was. Across the room, beside a potted fern, Eleanor stood beside Lady Dunthorpe, her employer. She wore a gown of dove-grey muslin trimmed with navy ribbon, her dark hair drawn back into a simple chignon. The candlelight warmed her cheeks and turned the silver brooch at her throat to fire. She looked different. Not like a stranger, but like a woman who had been seen. Polished, composed, graceful. But she was still his Eleanor, the woman who had knelt in the snow beside him, blood on her hands, fire in her eyes. She turned. Their eyes met. Her breath caught. Her fingers froze around her fan. He stepped forward instinctively, but stopped at a respectful distance. Lady Dunthorpe, distracted by a gentleman's extravagant bow, turned away for a moment. Eleanor glanced quickly between her and Julian, hesitating, calculating. "Eleanor," he said, low and urgent. Her expression warred between disbelief and a flare of something deeper. "You came," she whispered. "I had to." "You shouldn't have." "I know." His voice gentled. "But I couldn't stay away." She bit her lip, her hands clenched at her sides. "Lady Dunthorpe doesn't like me leaving her side during events." Julian glanced toward the widow, now deep in conversation. "Just a moment, please." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. They slipped out onto the terrace. Outside, the air was cold and damp with mist. The terrace overlooked a small garden hedge, glazed with a breath of frost. Eleanor's slippers crunched softly on the stone as she stopped beside the balustrade. "I thought you'd forgotten me," she said quietly. "I couldn't," Julian answered, "even if I'd wanted to. I didn't expect this, not here, not like this. I didn't come for society." He turned to her. "I came for you." She looked away. "You don't belong in my world, Julian." "You're right," he said, "but you belong in mine." "No." Her voice broke a little. "I don't. I never will. They'll never let me forget who I am." "I don't care what they say, or what they remember." "I do." He reached for her hand, but didn't take it. Hovered just inches away. She looked up at him. "I don't want to be pitied." "Then be loved instead." That made her blink. They stood in silence, breath misting between them. "I should go back inside," she said eventually, though she didn't move. "I'll call on you tomorrow," Julian said, "at Lady Dunthorpe's." "Why?" He hesitated, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but steady. "Because I'm going to ask you to be my wife." Eleanor stared at him, wide-eyed, and for the first time in weeks, the breath in her lungs felt light. Chapter 8. A Love Reclaimed. Bath, January 1814. The invitation came at breakfast, not a summons, not a command, a request. The card was written in Julian's hand, the wax seal stamped with the crest of Ashbourne. No flourish, no embellishment. It was delivered to Lady Dunthorpe's Bath townhouse early the next morning, tucked into an envelope addressed with care. Lady Dunthorpe took the card in her thin fingers, adjusted her spectacles, and read aloud. Lady Dunthorpe, I respectfully request the honour of Miss Eleanor Grayson's company at Ashbourne House this morning. If you would accompany her as chaperone, I would be grateful. I seek only a brief conversation, one without interruption. Julian Blackwell, Duke of Ashbourne. The widow gave Eleanor a long, measuring look over the rim of her spectacles. Well, she said at last, at least the boy remembers his manners. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. 11 o'clock, Lady Dunthorpe said briskly, setting the invitation aside. Wear the blue wool, not the grey muslin. She paused. Then, in a voice almost too casual, added, I'll have Louise help with your hair. It ought to look well. No sense going to a duke with pins falling out. Eleanor blinked. That's very kind. Lady Dunthorpe harumphed. It's practical. Don't romanticise it. But she reached for her teacup with a small, knowing smile. Ashbourne House had the kind of elegance that whispered old money. No ostentation, no flamboyance. Just polished stone, quiet power, and the sense that the world would rearrange itself to suit the people inside it. Eleanor had never been so terrified. She followed Lady Dunthorpe up the grand stone steps, her gloves perfectly white, her bonnet ribbon tied with shaking hands. She reminded herself to breathe. The butler received them with appropriate formality, though Eleanor noticed the barest flicker of warmth in his eyes as he looked at her. Word had travelled then, even below stairs. They were shown to a sunlit drawing room with damask walls and a fire crackling low in the grate. Julian stood by the hearth, dressed not in ducal finery, but a simple blue coat and soft trousers, as though trying to put her at ease. He turned when they entered, and everything else disappeared. Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet, reverent. She curtsied. Your Grace. He winced, a half smile on his lips. Still, Your Grace? After everything? Lady Dunthorpe cleared her throat. I shall take tea in the blue parlour. 10 minutes. She fixed Julian with a look sharp enough to chisel marble. Not 11. She left with surprising grace for a woman of her age. Eleanor was alone with him. Or nearly alone. A footman lingered in the corridor beyond the open door, visible by design. Julian crossed the room slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, rising as she entered the room. Eleanor stood very straight, her gloved hands folded over one another. You asked me to. Yes, he said. But I asked more than that last night. You did. Her voice was steady, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes, the vulnerability of a woman who had once been left behind. And now it's morning, she added quietly. Sometimes things said at midnight don't survive the dawn. This does, he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring, not new, but glowing with time and memory. Gold, engraved with a delicate braid of laurel leaves. It was my grandmother's, he said. She was the last person in this family to marry for love, and the last to be truly happy. He went to one knee. Eleanor froze. The fire snapped softly, and then he looked up at her with nothing but truth in his eyes. Eleanor Grayson, he said, will you marry me? Her throat closed. Her heart thundered in her chest. Julian, I know the difference between duty and devotion. I want you not because I must, but because I cannot imagine another day without you. She blinked rapidly, I'm not ready to be a duchess. Then be mine first. The rest will follow. She gave a breathless, incredulous laugh. You're mad. I am. For you. She looked at the ring, at the man on one knee in a house she'd never believed she'd enter. And she said, yes. He rose, slipped the ring onto her finger, and kissed her. Chaste but lingering, a promise wrapped in restraint. I will make you happy, he said, even if it kills me. You already have, she whispered. They were still close, hands twined, when suddenly a shadow swept across the carpet, followed by a voice as crisp as winter glass. I see I arrived just in time. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne stood in the doorway, draped in impeccable grey silk and a towering hat absolutely bristling with absurdity. Velvet ribbons, artificial berries, and what looked suspiciously like a stuffed starling tilting sideways over one eye. Her expression was cool, composed, utterly humourless, as though she were unaware that a small apple had just bobbed loose from its perch above her ear. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Julian turned but did not flinch. Mother. Eleanor's hand slipped from his. Your Grace, she said softly. The Duchess's gaze slid from Julian to Eleanor, resting on the ring, then back again. I suppose some girls know an opportunity when they see one, she said, voice like silk. Her gaze slid to Julian, cool and unimpressed. And some men are only too happy to be taken in. Chapter 9. Beneath the Frosted Sky. Bath, January 1814. The Dowager Duchess did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The housekeeper, the butler, the footman, and 2 maids all disappeared from the corridor the moment she stepped into the drawing room, leaving only Eleanor, Julian, and the terrifying silhouette of a woman wearing a hat fit for a pantomime stage. Velvet ribbons trailed like flagpoles. Beaded berries bounced with each slow, deliberate step. Somewhere near her left ear, a limp pheasant feather curled like a dying question mark. Julian didn't let go of Eleanor's hand. The Duchess's eyes lingered on the ring. I see you've inherited your father's talent for spectacle, she said, though I imagine even he might have hesitated before proposing to a girl he met in the woods. Mother, Julian said evenly, Miss Grayson saved my life. So I've been told. She stepped further into the room. And now you mean to ruin hers in return. Admirable symmetry. Eleanor tried to breathe. Her fingers tightened against Julian's, not with affection, but in silent warning. This was not the place. Not the time. Your Grace, she said, as calmly as she could. Forgive the suddenness of this moment. I'm sure you were not expecting— Oh, Miss Grayson, the Duchess interrupted. You are precisely what I was expecting. Her voice was not cruel, not loud, but it was polished and unyielding, like the hinge of a well-oiled gate that closed just before you could pass through. Quiet enough to be considered modest, pretty enough to catch attention, clever enough to know your place, or at least to pretend you've forgotten it. You are, in short, a perfect scandal. Julian turned on her. You will not speak to her that way. I'm not speaking to her. The Duchess's gaze cut to him. I'm speaking to you, and if you had the sense God gave you as a child, you would see the absurdity of this infatuation. It is not an infatuation. No, she said. That's what makes it so dangerous. A beat of silence stretched. Even the fire dared not crackle. Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice did not waver. You mistake a lack of consequence for a lack of character, she said, meeting the Duchess's gaze without flinching. I assure you, Your Grace, they are not the same. The Duchess blinked. Just once. It was the only reaction she allowed herself. Then a voice, dry, amused, and unmistakably aristocratic, called from the hallway. Is this a private execution Or may I intrude? All three turned. Lady Dunthorpe swept into the room without waiting for permission, trailing her rust-coloured shawl and the unmistakable scent of bergamot. Her cane tapped once on the marble as she stopped beside Eleanor and gave the Duchess a cool, assessing look. "Really, Cornelia," she said, tone dry, "you haven't changed at all, always so fond of entrances." The Dowager Duchess stiffened. "I wasn't aware this was your concern." Lady Dunthorpe smiled thinly. "Everything is my concern when my companion is being verbally skewered like a Sunday roast." She turned to Eleanor and gave her a nod of quiet approval. "I've had Miss Grayson in my home these past weeks," Lady Dunthorpe said, "and in that time she's been discreet, diligent, and more patient with my whist circle than any woman alive. If I had a daughter, I'd be proud to call her mine." Julian's throat worked once, but he said nothing. The Duchess's eyes narrowed. "You would throw your name behind hers?" Lady Dunthorpe didn't blink. "Gladly, and I dare say my name still opens a few doors, even next to yours." Silence. The tension snapped like a frost-laced branch. The Duchess turned to Eleanor, voice cold as January stone. "Return the ring." Eleanor froze. "If this farce is to end," the Duchess said, "let it end with at least a shred of dignity." Julian stepped forward. "No." His voice was low, steady. "This isn't your decision." "It's my name," she snapped, "and your father's legacy. You shame them both." "It's my name now," he said, jaw tight. "And if I give it to her, it will be with pride." Eleanor looked down. Her fingers trembled. Slowly, she slid the ring from her finger. The metal felt heavier than it should. "Eleanor," Julian began, stricken. But she held the ring out, and the Duchess took it with gloved fingers and quiet triumph. Lady Dunthorpe laid a hand on Eleanor's arm. "Come, my dear, we've had quite enough frost for one morning." She guided Eleanor from the room, leaving Julian staring at the empty doorway. A short while later, the carriage rolled slowly back through Bath. Eleanor sat beside Lady Dunthorpe, silent. Her gloves were damp, her ring finger bare. Lady Dunthorpe didn't press her. Only when they arrived home did the older woman say, dry as toast, "You carried yourself well. That's more than I can say for the Duchess of Ashbourne." Eleanor looked out the window, her voice very soft. "Today I had to be, my lady." That night. Eleanor closed her bedroom door with shaking hands. She undressed slowly, folding the blue wool gown and laying it across the chair with care, as though she might wear it again tomorrow, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath her feet. On her bedside table sat a small wooden box, unadorned, save for a curl of ivy carved into the lid. Inside lay a silk-wrapped bundle no bigger than a thimble. A lock of dark hair, bound in a ribbon. She had clipped it quietly, one wintry morning while he lay asleep beside the fire, his hair unruly as ever, falling across his brow. She hadn't meant to do it. The scissors were in her hand for something else entirely. Thread, perhaps. But then the thought had come, uninvited. One small piece of him, to keep, to remember. She had never told him. She never would. She lifted it now, pressed it to her chest, and finally, let the tears come. Not loud, not wild. Just quiet and relentless, soaking the sleeve of her shift as she curled onto the bed, knees drawn in, holding that small part of him against her heart like a relic from a vanished life. She had given back the ring. She had walked away with her head high. But in the dark, alone, she grieved what might have been. She did not hear the house settle, did not notice the fire go out. Only the steady beat of her own heart whispering his name into the silence. Julian. Julian. Chapter 10. A Choice Made in Winter. The morning after her heartbreak dawned grey and wet, the kind of rain that seeped rather than fell, soaking through wool and wood and bone. Eleanor rose early, mechanically. She dressed in the plainest gown she owned, twisted her hair into a serviceable knot, and took her tea by the kitchen fire, alone. The air smelled of coal and damp paper. Somewhere upstairs a maid dropped a hairbrush. Someone laughed too loudly. Life went on. She tried to. Lady Dunthorpe made no mention of the previous day. She sat at her usual place at breakfast, sipping strong coffee and reading the paper with precise indifference. It was as if they had both agreed, silently, not to name what had happened. But Eleanor could feel it in her chest, a hollow space where hope had lived. She spent the morning in quiet chores, a walk in the garden, though there were no blooms left to admire, sorting correspondence, mending a hem that did not truly need mending. Her fingers kept catching on the thread, and she did not ask herself why. She refused to wonder where he was. Elsewhere in Bath, Julian stood alone in the blue drawing room. She had been here, just yesterday. The chair by the hearth still angled slightly toward the fire, as if she might return at any moment. And somehow, that was worse. He had not slept. Not really. He had spent the entire night pacing, ignoring his mother's daggered silences, ignoring the quiet pressure of his title, his house, his obligations. He had thought the hardest part was remembering who he was. He'd been wrong. The hardest part was choosing who he wanted to be. He'd grown up in the shadow of a marriage built on calculation, alliances, family interests, cold affection masquerading as courtesy. He knew what was expected. He couldn't forget the look in Eleanor's eyes when she gave back the ring, grief and resolve held in equal measure. Julian crossed to the vestibule and rang for the butler. He wanted to go straight to her, to say what he hadn't said the day before. But not like this. Not without care. He turned instead to the writing desk. "No," he murmured. "Not yet." That afternoon, Lady Dunthorpe's residence. Eleanor was in the small sitting room, folding handkerchiefs that did not need folding, when Lady Dunthorpe appeared in the doorway, eyebrows lifted. "There's been a development." Eleanor's hands stilled. Her heart knocked against her ribs. "I don't think—" "He's not here," Lady Dunthorpe interrupted. "But this is—" She handed over the letter without ceremony. "I haven't opened it. I believe even I am not so wicked as to read a man's love letter without permission." Eleanor blushed scarlet. It was sealed in familiar blue wax, her name written in his hand. She turned away and opened it slowly, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. Julian's letter. "Eleanor, I have spent the past hours trying to decide whether I ought to forget you. It is the most impossible thing I have ever attempted. I cannot unknow the sound of your laugh in the snow. I cannot forget what it felt like to be helpless and find in you not pity but strength. You once nursed a stranger with no name. Not because you were told to, not because you had anything to gain, but because it was right. That is the kind of woman I wish to marry, not because I was lost, but because I am found. The house is quieter than I remembered it. It has never felt smaller. My mother will not change, but I will not ask you to bear her displeasure without my name, my protection, and my promise. So I offer them again, all of them, if you will have me. I shall wait in Sydney Gardens at 4 o'clock. You need only come. J." Eleanor read it once, then again, then folded it, slowly, and pressed the edge to her lips. Lady Dunthorpe said nothing, only handed her a pair of gloves and her cloak and murmured, "If you make him wait much longer, he'll start writing poetry, and no one wants that." Sydney Gardens. That afternoon. The air was sharp and wet, the bare branches dripping as if they too had just wept. Eleanor walked quickly, her skirts catching on the gravel, her heart galloping against her stays. And then she saw him. Not in ducal finery, not surrounded by servants or pomp or velvet, just Julian, in a coat slightly too thin for the cold, with damp curls clinging to his brow. He looked up. He saw her. And in the span of a breath, every inch of him changed. He started forward, then hesitated, and asked, "May I?" She nodded. He took both her hands in his. "I meant every word," he said. "But I will not ask again. You must choose." Her voice was steady. "I did. Yesterday, I chose to walk away." A flicker of pain passed through his expression. "And today," she whispered, "I choose to stay." Julian exhaled, something between relief and reverence. Then he kissed her. In the open air, beneath the wet branches, before God and whatever birds still braved the English winter. It was not passionate, not rushed. It was quiet and certain, and entirely theirs. Epilogue. Ashbourne Park, Spring 1817. The air at Ashbourne smelled of lilac and honeyed earth, and the first sunlight of April spilled over the lawn like gold poured from a careless hand. The house was still the same, grand, grey, symmetrical. But something had shifted. Not in the stones, but in the silences. There were fewer of them now. In the west-facing garden, beside a low wall of ivy and wisteria, a woman sat on a small iron bench with a rumpled bonnet in her lap. Eleanor. Her skirts curved softly over the swell of her stomach, though her gown was cut cleverly enough that only the observant might notice. She belonged now, not to anyone, but simply where she chose to stand. The bonnet was not hers. It belonged to the tiny creature currently toddling her way through a patch of crocuses with all the staggering gravity of a wayward duckling. "Margaret," Eleanor called gently, "you mustn't pull up the flowers. We talked about that." The little girl turned, dimple-cheeked and unapologetic, clutching a ruined crocus. "But it's for Papa." Eleanor smiled and set the bonnet aside. "Then we must hope your father has a fondness for ruined finery. That poor flower has seen better days." The library door opened just as she reached the steps. Julian stood there, coat unbuttoned, ink smudged faintly on one hand, and a smile that always made her forget whatever she'd meant to say. "Who's been committing botanical crimes in my name?" he asked, descending the steps. "Your daughter," Eleanor said, as Margaret barreled into him, crocus still clutched tight. Julian crouched to receive both child and flower. "Just like me," he said, examining it with serious gravity. "A bit worse for wear, but still hanging on." He grinned up at Eleanor, then straightened and crossed to her. His eyes drifted, as they often did these days, to the gentle swell beneath the soft blue of her day gown. He touched her waist lightly, reverently, and murmured, "Is it wrong that I'm hoping for a boy, if only to give Margaret someone else to manage?" Eleanor smiled. "I'm hoping for twins, so neither of us can sleep ever again." He laughed, kissed her forehead, and rested his palm where their second child grew. That evening, they dined in the small rosewood-panelled dining room that overlooked the orchard. The larger formal hall was rarely used, not since Eleanor had gently suggested they keep such grandeur for guests and ghosts. Margaret had been put to bed, after demanding 3 stories, 2 lullabies, and 1 lengthy debate about whether ducks wore boots in the snow. Her nursemaid had carried her off at last, half asleep and still clutching her favourite book. The table gleamed with polished silver and crystal, but there were no footmen hovering, no elaborate procession of dishes. Just a single maid in soft-soled shoes, and food that made the heart feel warm. There was roast duck, tender and brushed with orange glaze. New potatoes, golden and crisp, nestled beside buttery asparagus, so fresh it might have been coaxed up from the soil that morning. Warm bread with cracked salt and rosemary was passed between them in a linen-lined basket. At the centre of it all sat a chilled pear tart, its glaze glinting in the candlelight. "I think they've started humouring me," Eleanor murmured, eyeing the tart with clear affection. "I so much as mention pears and Mrs. Bartlett starts poaching them in syrup. Cook said she's testing a pear custard next." Julian smiled. "I suspect you're enjoying the power." "Shamelessly," she said, already reaching for a slice. "And I make no apologies." He poured her a small glass of watered wine, ignoring her mock-scandalized protest. "You'll have me falling asleep at the table," she murmured. "For the toast," he said, raising his own glass. "To ordinary days," he said, meeting her gaze. "To this." Eleanor touched her glass to his. "To this." That night, after the house had settled into its familiar hush, Eleanor stood at the window of the bedchamber and looked out over the lawns. The trees had begun to bud again. The stars blinked gently, as if half asleep. One hand rested on her belly. The other held the edge of the curtain, her fingers trailing idly along the lace. Julian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. She leaned into him, and for a long moment, they simply stood in silence, watching the soft blue dusk settle over the garden. He said quietly, "Even lovelier than I remembered." She turned her head just slightly. "The view?" "No," he said. "You. Here." Eleanor smiled. "You grow more poetic by the day. Whatever will become of your reputation." Julian kissed her gently on the cheek. "It's a small price to pay." It had been just over 4 years since she found him in the snow. Their wedding in Bath the following spring had been quiet, beautiful, and marked by one empty chair neither of them had mentioned. Eleanor never spoke of it, and Julian only once when he said very simply, "She chose not to attend. That's not a thing we can undo." And then, "But I would marry you 100 times, with or without her in the pew." The Dowager Duchess had returned to society with her usual flair. She reappeared in London draped in sapphire silk, an elaborate hat full of netting and strategic cherries, and on the arm of a baronet not a day over 30. She had begun calling her drawing room Cornelia's Court, and her Thursday salons were infamous. She never apologised, but she had some months ago arrived unexpectedly at Ashbourne, unannounced, elegant, cool as glass, and requested a few minutes with her granddaughter. Eleanor had let her in. The visit lasted 12 minutes. When it ended, Cornelia had made no comment on the state of the nursery or the child's shoes. But as she prepared to leave, she had smoothed a curl from Margaret's brow and said, "Headstrong, isn't she?" Eleanor had simply replied, "So I've been told." Cornelia had nodded, almost imperceptibly. "She'll do." No letters followed. But at the last supper of the season, it was quietly noted that Cornelia Ashbourne had refused to attend any event where the Duchess of Ashbourne was not invited. It was not affection, but it was, perhaps, respect. The rest of society had followed suit in its fashion. Some invitations vanished. Others came perfumed with duty and little else. One brave marchioness had declared the match positively poetic, and Lady Dunthorpe had replied, "If by poetic you mean inconvenient to the Duchess's pride, then yes." It had not been easy, not at first. But then the scandals faded. The stares turned to shrugs. Eleanor learned names, made allies, refused to simper. She gained a reputation for being clever and calm, a touch too honest, and never quite what anyone expected. Which suited her perfectly. There was nothing left to prove. Only a future to live. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. If you liked it, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. It's free, painless, and oddly satisfying. I'll be here with another tale soon, unless I've floated off into the clouds like this little bell. See you next time.